Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 74 of the Ask Historians podcast. I am, as you can maybe tell already, suffering from a little bit of laryngitis, so we're going to make today's intro a little bit short and sweet. We're going to be talking about the ancient Near East, which is, you may recall from the Bible, but also things like Babylon and Sumer and Assyria and the Hittites and ancient Egypt and all that. And really, we'll be specifically looking at practices of animal and even human sacrifice in these regions at the time. So it's a very interesting show, and I hope you enjoy it, but let's get to what you're all here for, which is, of course, the book giveaway. It's the first of the month, so all of our contributors on our Patreon account, which is at patreon.com/AskHistorians, are entered into a drawing to pick one of 4 books to be shipped to their home and just reread at their leisure. So $1 a month gets you 1 ticket, $5 2 tickets, $3 or $10 a month gets you 3 tickets. So our selection this month is Daniel Walker Howe's What God Hath Wrought, The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848. And that was actually suggested by our last guest for the Kansas-Nebraska Act episodes. We also have Hayden White's The Content of the Form, Narrative Discourse, and Historical Representation, which is basically, if you have this on your shelf, you're going to impress historians who come visit you. We also have Jonathan Harris, The Lost World of Byzantium, and that was suggested by a previous podcast guest as well, Schlin28. And finally, my pick for this month is Tamim Ansari's Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes. So, our winner of this month's book giveaway is Vlad. So, Vlad, I'll be contacting you through the email that you have for Patreon to figure out how best to get this to you. All right, and as promised, we're going to keep this intro short and sweet. Let's get on to the show, which was recorded pre-laryngitis, so you don't have to listen to this the entire time. I'll be back at the end of the show for some end of the show notes, and me and my busted vocal cords will see you then, okay?
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm here with Stuart Felker, who's known as KoineLingua on the forum, and we're going to be discussing ancient Near Eastern practices of sacrifice and sacrificial rituals. But before we do that, Stuart, will you give us an idea about what got you interested in the ancient Near East and the religious practices there?
Yeah, I actually come to all this by way of sort of a different area. I was first interested in ancient Indian religion and ancient Vedic texts. And for some reason, there's this interesting crossover between some sort of new forms of that religious practice and some ancient Christian religious practices. I don't really know how it happened, but I gradually started becoming more interested in ancient Judaism and Christianity through that. And of course, through Judaism, I was introduced to the ancient Near Eastern world. So my interests have hovered around ancient Judaism, forwards to Christianity and sort of backwards or, to the broader ancient Near Eastern context. So I arrived at it, from an interesting angle.
Well, we've used the term ancient Near East a couple times here, and since that's going to be our focus, kind of, both in terms of space and time, why don't you go ahead and just kind of set the stage and let us know, what is the ancient Near East and who are the people living there?
Right. So broadly, we're talking about a region that extends, about from the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, eastward roughly to the Persian Gulf. This is probably most well known to people as the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia. So if you start from the Mediterranean, you have some of the coastal cities. Of course, this is what we call Canaan. So we have the Israelites, we have the broad ethnic Canaanites, we have Phoenicia, we have the city of Ugarit. Of course, a little north to this, we have Syria, and even further north, we have, what's modern Turkey, and so ancient Anatolia. We have the Hittites there, which I think we'll talk a little bit about. But yeah, as we go east from, the Mediterranean seaboard, we're basically going to be in this area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is, of course, where the name Mesopotamia comes from, the land between the two rivers. And we have all these cities that popped up on the Tigris and Euphrates. We have, of course, the Akkadians, we have the Assyrians, and then as we go a little bit further east and get closer to the Persian Gulf, we have Sumer and Babylonia, and some other city-states or large cities concentrated in that area.
And can this area be seen as kind of a cohesive whole, like kind of a cultural region where there's kind of a general understanding in terms of the religious practices and rituals, and at least some basic understandings about the divine? Because I know we particularly like to think of the Israelites as being very distinct from these other groups, but right. I guess it's a two-part question of, are they really that distinct? And if they are distinct, then does that mean all these other groups are kind of share a similarity?
Right. I think we can approach this from a couple of different angles. One, just a very basic, primitive way to approach this is almost linguistically. Some of these cultures share a common ancestor in terms of language. The Akkadians and the Syrians and the Israelites and the Phoenicians all spoke Semitic languages. Of course, they descended from an ancestor which is called Proto-Semitic. But yeah, along with the language, there's a sort of common cultural bed of sometimes mythology and ritual practices. Now, sometimes it's hard to differentiate between, what sort of ritual practices were picked up by a neighboring culture, and which sort of descended from common ancestors. But I think there are definitely senses in which we can understand this as a common cultural area. There's a sort of similar structures in pantheons, as we're going to talk about, obviously. There are many sacrificial practices that are very similar. But
I was just going to say, let's go ahead and maybe get into a little bit of those sacrificial practices, though, because I think, I kind of want to start off first with the more, I think would be more common and more generally accepted practice of just sacrificing animals. And, it seems like there's a huge amount of variation. When I was doing my background research on this, it seems like there was a huge amount of variation, but also kind of a huge amount of coherence around some general concepts of it. So with this kind of multiplicity of the way animal sacrifices were carried out, but at the same time, I noticed that there seemed to be kind of a general agreement about the reasons they were carried out, kind of the idea of like, why are we doing this? And can you talk a little bit about, kind of the reasons and the background, the understanding about why animal sacrifice is being carried out?
Right. So you're definitely right that there is a huge variety, but again, some pretty fundamental similarities. Sacrifice was done for a variety of purposes: to propitiate the gods, if you will, to generally gain the gods' favor, but also for a lot of other purposes that, of course, would involve the gods as well. But it was sort of done to preserve cosmic order. Whenever there was a sort of threat to a particular city, or, whether that was an army or a natural, sort of like a plague, sacrifices would be made to sort of ward that off, or in hopes that it would ward it off. There's also this really interesting sense, and I think we're going to see this come up several times in our discussion, but there's a sense that sacrifice is food for the gods. And of course, there's this question about exactly how they understood food here, whether this was actually understood literally or if this was figurative, or both. But we see this over and over again. So that's definitely one area which you see wide agreement from ancient Israel to Mesopotamia, sacrifice as meals for the gods. There are a lot of other ritual practices, though, that are very common.
Yeah, so you said that these sacrifices come up when there's some sort of kind of crisis, but were there also kind of like standard practices? I guess you could say like every Easter we sacrifice a bunny, right, kind of thing like that. But were there kind of like regular like weekly or monthly practices that were going on at the same time?
Absolutely. In fact, you can almost look at it in three different dimensions here. There are daily sacrifices, there are sacrifices that were performed on certain days of the month, and of course there are annual sacrifices, particularly at festivals.
And I do actually want to get back to the question of what it means to feed a god, but just to go down this road just a little more, were these sacrifices, because if you're doing a daily sacrifices, that's something you would be doing like in your home, And you wouldn't be like, sacrificing, your prize bull every day. So, was there kind of a difference between like smaller home sacrifices, if there were any, and larger festival sacrifices at specialized temples or anything like that?
Right. Yeah. So over and over again, we're going to see that sacrifice is sort of stratified along economic lines. And yeah, you're exactly right. Not everyone can afford to sacrifice their prize bull every day. And so, along this economic dimension, especially in the Hebrew Bible, but elsewhere in the ancient Near East, we can see that, the poor are allowed to make sort of what they kind of conceive of as substitutionary sacrifices. If you cannot afford the money to pay for, a great sacrifice, you would buy, you would sacrifice smaller animals, birds or less prized livestock.
And what was kind of the two, what kind of birds are being sacrificed here? Is this something that you would, with the kind of, the jokey, sacrifice a bunny on Easter kind of thing, was this something that if you were sacrificing at home, you would then, eat the animal? Or is this something that you would, specifically, because I know there's a lot of like burning of entrails and things like that as part of, sacrifice at this time. But, what was actually the kind of like the, I guess, logistics of performing an animal sacrifice and what would happen to it afterwards? Yeah,
I guess I should emphasize that there are different sort of areas or locations, if you will, where a sacrifice was done. So yeah, the private personal sacrifice is one dimension of it, but almost more important are the temples of various ancient Near Eastern cities. So yeah, the temples were sort of the locus of sacrifice for the city. For example, in an Israelite context, you would go to the temple, and of course people would do this often on their annual pilgrimage at various festivals, but you'd go and buy an animal there, and then the priests would actually sacrifice the animal for you. So it's definitely not all private. And in fact, most sacrifices being done by the temple cult. The king himself in ancient Near Eastern cities is very much involved in this. And of course, you have the cultic personnel of the temple. And these are all people who are going to basically sacrifice for you. Now, there are occasions in which, again, on big annual festivals, where the whole community would sort of come together, and it'd be much more of a communal affair.
And so, were these animals then being eaten by the priests, or I guess what I'm getting at is like, after you kill the animal, what do you do with it?
Right. The bits of the animal, the meat of the animal, if you will, were given to eat to the temple personnel and to the king. There's some really interesting variation in practices here. In sort of the older Mesopotamian practice, you actually have this interesting situation in which the food would be presented to the god first. In fact, it'd be presented behind a curtain. And it's kind of unknown exactly what they thought happened there, but the best we can tell, they thought that the gods would sort of ingest, maybe spiritually or metaphysically somehow ingest the sacrifice. But of course, actually after this, it would be the king who would actually eat the sacrifice, and some of the temple personnel as well. Of course, in other contexts, you have the meat actually being burned whole. And again, this is sort of characteristic of Israelite practice, although not exclusive to it. And there's actually been some academic misunderstanding of this issue. Some people think that Israel was really one of the only cultures that sacrificed animals whole. But that actually isn't true. And we see some of the neighbors of Israel performing whole sacrifices. But again, there were different parts of the animal that were used. For example, in a Greek context, it was really only the bones of the meat and a layer of fat that were used to be burned to the gods. But the rest of the meat would be eaten by various temple personnel.
Yeah, and I guess the actual like burning of entrails and offal and bones and fat and things like that. I guess that makes sense in a more like very direct metaphorical way of like, the smoke rising up to the gods and, and therefore I guess them feeding off it that way. You burn it and the more, transmorphs into whatever happens to feed the sustenance of the god. But I mean, this comes back to our question earlier that you had mentioned about what does it mean to feed a god? What was the concept of, the divine here? I mean, were the gods like real creatures, or were they kind of more these metaphysical concepts at the time?
That's the $1,000,000 question of sacrifice. There generally was a sense in which there was a literal conception that the gods needed sacrifice to survive. Really, there's no telling exactly how this was worked out. But, there is, from more of a figurative angle, devotion to the gods sort of pleases them to sustain the cosmic order. So in these conceptions, the gods were sort of responsible for everything that happened on Earth, every sort of working, every sort of bad or good thing that happened in these cities could be ascribed to the workings of the gods and whether you were in their good favor or not. So sacrificing to the gods was, of course, a way of, I guess we could speak of honoring them. So if they were not given honor, they would withdraw their divine support. Again, really, it's anyone's guess as to what it meant for a god to be sustained by the food. Of course, this is about as anthropomorphic as you can get. And so there's this obviously this dimension where divine sacrifice or divine reality in general is a mirror of earthly reality. And, I think this can actually get to this sort of profound issue of something that really gives us insight into how cultures work in general. If the gods are being neglected, you can think of this in a sort of cosmic sense, but you can also just think of it in a basic cultural sense. The more gods are neglected, well, the more that they start to fade from history. And so the gods are sort of dependent upon the cultures that worship them, for their very existence. I mean, being dead to history is kind of being dead enough for gods. And so consider it a sort of starvation of the gods.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a kind of a collusion here, as you were talking about, because at this time, these gods are really kind of specific ethnic gods when it comes down to it. Each group has their own kind of, even though some gods and, pantheons might kind of share similarities or bleed over, but, you might have each city having their own kind of primary or paramount god, and therefore kind of, if you're not worshiping them correctly, it's an indication that your culture itself has, I guess you could say declined in some sense, but has definitely changed in the sense that it's kind of a proxy for the vibrancy of the community itself.
Exactly. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
So my kind of follow-up question to that is, am I being overly general by saying that, each group would have their own god and that really it's just that group sacrificed into that god? Or was there kind of a greater understanding that sacrifices need to be performed by, multiple people in a sense to keep the universe running? Because I guess what I'm doing is I'm drawing upon my own background here in Mesoamerica, where at least there was a very direct metaphor for feeding the gods through sacrifice and through blood. But it was seen as kind of this cross-cultural thing where it's yes, we all recognize that this has to be done, even if it's not going, all to the same God. It all goes to the same kind of divine force that runs the universe.
Yeah, I'm more inclined to view it in sort of an individualistic context. And of course, we could look at this from a broad angle and just sort of broader, we're talking about these ancient empires, we're talking about conglomerations of cities. I'm still, I guess, inclined to view that the locus of this upkeep of order was sort of on the city level almost. I mean, think about when two cities battle with each other. I'm thinking that, I guess in some sense, there's a sort of understanding this was a copy of a divine war. And in fact, some of the well-known, mythological epics of Mesopotamia do have this sort of sense where there's a mirror, where you read these mythological texts, but really there's a subtext that these are sort of wars, very human wars. These are sort of embodying characters for cities or something. And we especially see this in an Egyptian context, besides just Mesopotamia. Of course, but when we zoom in at the city itself, I mean, I think it's not just, the king, of course, is very important in performing sacrifice. And if the king neglects sacrifice, this can spell disaster for the city. But there are many other things in the city that could pollute things. It could be other individuals neglecting sacrifice that could also, invite the wrath or displeasure of the gods.
So once again, kind of getting back to, I think we've kind of done a pretty good overview here of the kind of I guess the theology behind it, the philosophy behind it. But it sounds like it was kind of almost like a kind of a contractual thing where, if the people are doing their sacrifices to the god, then the god gives them favor. And it's like this compact between, the divine and the mundane of the people. Right. Where it's like, if you support me, then I will continue to give favor onto you. I mean, so were there specific instances where people would actually sacrifice to gain additional favor? Because we had started this off by saying that these sacrifices were done in times of crisis, but we also had these regular sacrifices. But was there kind of you wanted to get a good land deal, so you went to the temple and sacrificed a goat or a lamb or something like that?
Yeah, so sacrifice could be done, like we said at the beginning, for a variety of purposes. You, of course, mentioned sort of the citywide things about plagues and stuff, but yeah, this is just as true on the individual level. If one wanted to know something about their fate, or if one wanted to perform a sort of divinatory rite to learn something about the universe, sacrifice was an integral part of this. And yeah, sickness on an individual level as well. There's also sort of general well-being offerings that would be done at various points in life, or again on sort of scheduled occasions, specific festival days or other days, where an offering would be made just in hopes of general well-being.
And did we also have kind of a redemption kind of narrative as well? Because I know in doing some of my background research for this, there was also kind of these rituals that performed to kind of cleanse, you sacrifice an animal, and the guilt of that community or the guilt of an individual person goes into that animal and is then cleansed from those people.
Right.
Sacrifice.
Yeah, this is the scapegoat ritual, or at least what's most commonly known as the scapegoat ritual. And actually this appears in a few different forms throughout the Near East, and even in ancient Greece. I mean, this is probably most well known in the Israelite context in the Bible, and this is associated with Yom Kippur, which incidentally is coming up just in a few days. Yeah, the impurity or the sins of the people could be sort of transferred to these animals, and whether that was by sort of laying on of hands, which was done in the biblical context, but somehow it's thought this sort of corporate, metaphysical force of sin or impurity could be transferred to animals, and then the animals would usually be sent away from the city. Sometimes they could actually be slaughtered. That would be as if the threatening force or the impurity would be, of course, destroyed in that. But yeah, not only could this be done for animals, but actually this was done for humans as well.
So, I mean, you had a scapegoat who is less of a goat, more of a person then?
Exactly.
And, how would that be different? Because, I mean, would they be slaughtering this person? Or what would be, how would this different from a typical, an actual goat?
Right. Again, there are two different ways that this could be done. The person who's assuming the sin could be sort of exiled away from the city, cursed to the wilderness, or they actually could be killed as well.
I mean, I guess I know from my own, background in Mesoamerica that there's a pretty specific, human sacrifice being a little bit bigger in that context. There were some specific, rituals and practices that were going on there. But, how would this person be killed? And kind of how frequent and how prevalent was this practice?
One of the more common ways they would be killed is they would be stoned to death. Yeah, as for the frequency, this is a really interesting issue. On some occasions, it seems to be done annually. In other occasions, it's, again, situational. This is something that was done in times of crisis. There's another ritual that's sort of related to this broad category. It's not quite what we call a scapegoat ritual, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, and it definitely ties into it, and especially could be a nice segue into this issue of human sacrifice. But for Assyria, they had this ritual called the substitute king ritual. This is when there would be some sort of threat to the city or to the overarching area. And this threat would usually be thought to be aimed at the king himself. Of course, this would be discerned by, omens and divination. Yeah, these priests and others, reading the entrails of animals for signs and to threats both to the city and to the king. But when the king was thought to be particularly threatened, what would happen is that they would take a citizen, and usually this would be a sort of lowly citizen, maybe a slave or some very lower class person. And by the way, this is going to be a theme that we're going to see over and over again about the sort of marginalized that are brought into this. But interesting enough, this citizen would be sort of dressed in the regalia of the king. He would actually wear the king's robe. He'd be given a staff. I mean, it was basically hoped, quite literally, that the gods would be tricked into thinking, this guy is wearing the king's robe. This guy appears to be the king. And so whatever sort of threat to the king there was would actually be thought to be aimed at this citizen. And of course, the king would be taken away from the palace. But after this was done, after the threat had passed, however they discerned that, this citizen would actually be killed. And I guess it'd be sort of a way of the threat coming to be realized. The humans killing them would be thought to be the gods had some sort of hand, and that they really came through on their threat.
Yeah, sort of a sense that look guys, the gods, you got the king, quote unquote, move along, nothing to see here.
Exactly.
Yeah. This is a little bit interesting because I don't think we mostly associate, the ancient Near East with, human sacrifice, although, I guess I could definitely have heard it, talked about before. And I think the major thing that I've heard about is, sacrifices to Baal, which would be like child sacrifices. Although I think that may be more in the Phoenician context, right?
Right. Yeah. So human sacrifice has basically become known to us through, well, at least originally, looking broadly throughout history, we've known about this from the biblical texts, and we've known about it from Greek and Roman sort of ethnographers or writers who had sort of chronicle these practices. And of course, we always have to be cautious here about what is myth and what is reality. A mainstay of ancient cultures is that people are going to be demonizing each other, and they're going to be, ascribing practices to them that in some cases we know almost certainly were not true. So fact and fiction, it's sometimes hard to separate. But from the Israelite context, practice of child sacrifice ascribed to sort of the neighboring Canaanites. And yeah, this was exactly done to Baal, which was one of the supreme deities in various Canaanite societies.
Yeah, and was this a regular frequent thing? Or actually, before we get into kind of if it was a regular frequent thing, was it a real thing? Because, we just discussed that, ancient, historians and ethnographers, one thing they love to do is tell you about how horrible all the other people are. So do we actually have evidence and knowledge and, maybe even archaeological context of showing that, these child sacrifices really did happen?
Yeah, this is really one of the most interesting things that's happened over the past century or so in scholarship. Yeah, there was definitely skepticism about whether these child sacrifices were real. In fact, up until the past few decades, I think the 70s is kind of a seminal point in this debate. You have a really famous book written in the 70s by Edward Said called Orientalism. This really sort of turned everyone's attention to how non-Western cultures could be sort of misconstrued in both, overt and subtle ways. Their histories, their practices, their religion, their psychology. So along with this came sort of a greater sort of skepticism as to whether, ancient Israelite or Greek and Roman texts, whether these really did portray these accurately. But, at the same time that we had this movement in the 70s, we also had some sort of breakthroughs, both archaeological and textual. there's excavations of the Phoenician colonies, especially in North Africa, where we started to discover bones of children that were burned, and very young children as well. And these were accompanied by sort of inscriptions that were clearly construed these as sort of offerings to the gods. And yeah, Baal is one of the famed gods involved with this. Yeah, from an Israelite context, yeah, there's skepticism as to whether Israel's neighbors actually practice this. And this is an interesting area where we see that if we look at like sort of mainland, coastal Phoenicia, this is on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, sort of where Israel is, we actually don't find much archaeological evidence for human or child sacrifice there. Again, that's mainly from a North African context. However, there's been sort of breakthroughs in our understanding of the biblical texts where we've sort of looked at them in conjunction with the archaeological findings. We've sort of made connections between the inscriptions in North Africa of child sacrifice and sort of the language of child sacrifice used in the Bible. And, I have to emphasize here that when we talk about the Canaanites, we're really talking about a sort of broad ethnic group. Of course, the Israelites themselves are thought to descend from this group, and the Phoenicians as well. And so there is this common pool of tradition here. So that gives us a clue that there may be a deeper connection here, going back deeper in history, even beyond the time of the texts themselves. Another really interesting development here was in the Israelite context in the Bible, this is, of course, like considered a quintessential foreign practice. Orthodox or, official Israelite religion, of course, does not practice child sacrifice. This is something that, the sort of barbarian other practices. But one of the big innovations that's come up, over the past couple decades has been understanding child sacrifice as a more, I guess we'd say, orthodox part of ancient Israelite religion, that this wasn't just something that happened on the fringes, that this wasn't just a heterodox practice, that maybe at some very early strata of Israelite religion, this was a practice that was condoned or even encouraged.
Yeah, we do have, of course, the famous story of Abraham being told by God to, quite literally sacrifice his son. And Abraham is, he starts to go through with it, and then God kind of says, "Nah, that's fine." It's an interesting part in the Bible, but it seems like, is that just like a metaphor, or are you saying that maybe that actually reflects some sort of older practices where child sacrifice was present among the ancient Israelites?
Right. And, we picked a pretty fortuitous time to talk because actually yesterday was the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And on the second day of Rosh Hashanah in the Jewish liturgy, actually the official reading for the day is the Ekedah, which is the 22nd chapter of Genesis, in which Abraham has his sort of averted sacrifice. So yeah, this has been really one of the key things people have looked toward, this averted sacrifice of Abraham's son Isaac. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. One common understanding has been that this is sort of an etiology, an origin story for encouraging the Israelites to not practice sacrifice. Of course, in the story, at first, God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and he starts to go through with it. But then right before it happens, in fact, the knife is more or less in the air, about to come down on him. The sacrifice is averted. Basically, a voice from the heavens comes and says, "Do not do this." And in its place, Abraham is actually presented with an animal to sacrifice. So some people have considered that this is a sort of story of the transition between the Israelites, breaking away from their neighbors who would actually practice human sacrifice and practicing animal sacrifice instead.
So it's a substitution that kind of also marks a cultural distinction or a cultural and ethnic distinction from neighbors.
Right. And I should emphasize here that there are a lot of different ways to look at this narrative. Some people have actually proposed that the original narrative had Abraham go through with the sacrifice of Isaac. And if you read the narrative itself, Isaac sort of is mysteriously absent from the rest of, at least that narrative. That's certainly not a majority view, though. But what is interesting is that even if, this sacrifice wasn't gone through with, even if Abraham stopped doing this, the story was still used throughout Jewish history in conjunction with child sacrifice. Of course, this leads us to Christianity. The early Christians seem to have made quite ample use of the story and, construing Jesus kind of like a new Isaac.
Yeah, and I want to get to the significance and the symbolism of Jesus as a sacrifice in a second. To return back to our Canaanite and our Phoenician neighbors of the Israelites, you had mentioned earlier that we often see that it's not the elites or their children that are being sacrificed, in like scapegoat rituals and such like that, but it's usually someone who is from a marginalized group. So, do we know from what we have in terms of both text and archaeology? Do we know what the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, were they sacrificing the children of the elite, or were these kind of more like a we often hear of Greeks practicing infanticide by leaving deformed babies out to die? Was it more like that?
There are a few different things here. There seems to be some evidence in Phoenician child sacrifice that there was a sort of annual lot drawn for who would be sacrificed. And if you look at the Greek and Roman authors, you see a few different instances in which they say that there are to be like 1 or 2 sacrifices a year. That's just one element of it. There are also occasions on which there would be a sacrifice made, a festival or something like that. There's also the individual level of firstborn sacrifice. Now, this is something that's really interesting when we look at it in conjunction with the Israelite and biblical portrayals of child sacrifice and other laws that we see in the Bible. So there does seem to have been an actual tradition where everyone would sacrifice their firstborn son. There are a lot of things to debate about this, and a lot of things are unclear, so I don't mean to suggest certainty on some of these things, but we do see in the Greek and Roman ethnographers, we see a couple instances in which the lot for the annual sacrifice, or just the regular firstborn sacrifice, falls on, a king or a military leader. And sometimes these people would try to get around this, and we see these authors actually talking about them kind of like substituting their own children. They don't want to sacrifice their firstborn child, so they find, the child of a slave and sacrifice him or her.
But the symbolism is still there of it being kind of, we require the best of you for sacrifice. And in that sense, Abraham sacrificing Isaac or God sacrificing Jesus makes sense.
Exactly. And we see this word come up over and over of the beloved son. This is, of course, most famously applied to Isaac. We see it also in another story in the Bible. In the 11th chapter of the book of Judges, we have a guy there named Jephthah. He makes a vow. He asks God, he's fighting the Ammonites, and he says that if you will secure victory, help me secure victory here, I will sacrifice the first thing that I see on my way home. And of course, the first thing he sees happens to be his daughter. And of course, he's dismayed about this, but he says, I can't go back on my oath. I made a vow, I'm going to have to do it. And Jephthah's daughter submits to this. We see of similar sacrifices, and we see actually a really interesting parallel there in Greek literature. I think in conjunction with the Trojan War, we have Agamemnon and his daughter Iphigenia. He makes almost an identical vow there but he actually characterizes it as sacrificing the loveliest thing that the year gave birth to, is the language he uses. Yeah, this itself is interesting for the sort of like agricultural connections there. And again, we might look at a connection there between the annual festivals of the harvest, which has been proposed as one of the festivals in which children would be sacrificed. So one really interesting recent suggestion has been that, we talk about firstborn child sacrifices, and of course we think of these as happening, shortly after birth. But there's been in conjunction with the loveliest thing that the year gave birth to, or whatever, there's been the suggestion that people would actually sacrifice their firstborn child on these annual festivals. So they would sort of wait a little while.
So we had talked, you had mentioned a little bit about the agricultural context of, sacrificing your firstborn son. But, what was the scope and the kind of the prevalence of this? I mean, was everyone, every time harvest came around, was everybody sacrificing their firstborn son? Or is this something more that is a bit more metaphorical and uncommon?
Really, when it comes to it, we kind of have a lot of speculation here. And I should emphasize that this idea that children were sacrificed specifically during harvest festivals or things like that is actually, it's kind of speculative, but it's beginning to be talked about more and more in the scholarship. When we're talking about Israel, I think the main thing that we're talking about, and one of the things that we just have to keep in mind in general, is that from the evidence of the biblical texts, we have this common theme of substitution. So whatever early laws there may have been for the Israelites that suggested child sacrifice, in a later context, the biblical texts are definitely talking about you could sort of substitute an animal for this. So there actually isn't archaeological evidence that the Israelites are practicing child sacrifice. It's basically something that's inferred from both the textual data and the comparative archaeology.
Actually, I think that kind of brings us more towards a bit of an epilogue here. And I think the question is then, why aren't people still sacrificing, bulls and goats and things like that?
For the ancient Israelites, I mean, they clearly were disturbed by this process. And I mean, and they're polemic against their neighbors. I mean, they think it's a horrid practice. The ancient Jews weren't very conscious, like we are today, of this idea of like literary strata in the Bible. So they didn't really understand the idea that maybe, there are older laws that were superseded by newer ones, or they definitely didn't understand the idea that there could be, sort of contradictory laws, things like this. I mean, they thought ancient rabbinic Jews, kind of thought of the laws of the Bible as perfect. And so to whatever extent they were conscious of this idea of child sacrifice, and again, this is pretty sparse, like their conceptions of it were mainly oriented to this idea of substitution, that animals were to be sacrificed and not humans were to be, not humans.
Yeah, but even the animal sacrifice itself kind of went away after a while. Was there a particular point where we can see a break between, when you would sacrifice a lamb or something like that to the point where you would instead just maybe not do that?
I think this gets at one of the most interesting and almost ironic aspects of this. When we're talking about the end of sacrifice, I mean, most broadly throughout the ancient Near East, sacrifice ended basically when a city ended. So sacrifice pretty much would go on for as long as there were people there to make sacrifice. There wasn't really this ideological move to, say that some animal sacrifice is wrong or that it's anything like this. In an Israelite context, we do start to see this. And I mean, I guess the big irony here is that if the cessation of animal sacrifice is often thought to be a Christian development, that's precisely because Jesus, the child of God, was thought to be the one true sacrifice. So if in an ancient Israelite context, children were not sacrificed and animals were substituted, in the Christian context, animals weren't sacrificed because Jesus, the child of God, had been sacrificed, and that his sacrifice was sort of so valuable that no more sacrifice needed to be done. Of course, in an actual non-Christian Jewish context, sacrifice ended when the temple was destroyed in the 1st century. And again, that gets to this idea that the Israelites, that the temple was so important for them that, that all animal sacrifice would be done at the temple. And so once the temple was gone, there was no place to really offer a legitimate sacrifice. That being said, we sort of see this conjunction between Judaism and Christianity here, because in the absence of a temple and in absence of a place to sacrifice animals, you see these sort of other things conceived of as being legitimate sacrifices. Scholars talk about this sort of spiritualization of sacrifice, where they talk about people's own prayers being sort of offerings to gods. I mean, this is perfectly exemplified in both Judaism and Christianity. We even see a little bit of this in the Hebrew Bible itself. We see this sort of developing notion, and sometimes this is associated with like a later prophetic mindset that God desires mercy and not sacrifice. But we see these things picked up on by the Christians, and when it comes down to it, we see prayers and good deeds being conceived of as sort of substitutions for animal sacrifice.
Are there still, so it seems like, at least in the Jewish context, there's the destruction of the temple, which was the center of sacrifice of animals. And there's also kind of this kind of evolving cultural shift as well. And in the Christian sense, there's the sense that, well, Jesus has made the ultimate sacrifice, and therefore that kind of supersedes all the rest. And then as the region Christianizes, that kind of supplants these older practices. But do we still have pockets of people in the modern Near East who are still carrying out these sacrificial rituals?
I would love to know that. You see, I think you're definitely right that the Christianization of the world sort of overtook these practices, not just in Judaism, but of course with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Do you still see Roman sacrifice being made still in the 4th century? Post-Constantine is when, of course, Christianity's major ascendancy happened in the Roman Empire. And so you see sacrifice finally start to decline there. I don't really know much about what's going on in the modern world. There are isolated reports that some of the Bedouin in the Middle East have these sort of rites of sacrifice. I don't know if exactly it gets to the level of child sacrifice.
Probably not. That'd be a bigger story.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I think we do still have, particularly I'm thinking of, certain traditional festivals in Iran, Persian festivals that, where there might be like a sacrifice of a sheep or something like that, that kind of, I guess, how does sacrifice echo down through the ages to us? Is it still something that's significant in this region?
Yeah, I think we do carry this legacy of sacrifice with us, at least in our religious traditions. For however, Christianity wanted to get away from sacrifice, like in the end, like almost, everything about the earliest Christianity involving Jesus' death is portrayed along the idea of sacrifice. And of course, like there's this metaphor kind of martyrdom as well. But, originally this wasn't really a metaphor at all. Martyrdom is associated with Christianity, but it actually predates it in Judaism. We think of the Maccabees and the Maccabean literature here. And this was a time when the Jews were, of course, being widely sort of persecuted for their fidelity to the law. They're, being forced to, by the Greeks and Romans to eat, pigs and things like this. But some of them, held fast to their traditions. When they were persecuted, they kind of understood this to be a sacrifice. They, the blood of the righteous can like purify the land. So yeah, I think there are senses in which we've understood martyrdom. We have this metaphor of sacrifice that still to this day we use.
And of course, every Jewish mother will tell you how much she sacrificed for you, of course.
Of course.
All right. Stuart, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us on the Ask Historians podcast today.
Thanks a lot, Sean.
And as always, thank you all for listening, and a big thanks to our Patreon supporters, particularly one in particular, 40K Freak, for their support of the show. And I hope this show kind of shed some light on the ancient Near East. Typically, we see it mostly this time period in this area. We see it often through a very biblical lens, and we did spend a lot of time talking about the Israelites and referring to kind of biblical things as well. But we also got a chance to look at some of the other practices in the region and kind of develop it as a whole region unto itself, not simply kind of a sideshow to, the trials and travails of the Israelites. I also hope that my interjections about constantly comparing sacrifice in the Near East to sacrifice in Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia versus Mesoamerica, wasn't too irritating to you all. But I do enjoy kind of picking apart some of the more metaphorical and philosophical aspects of come down to sacrifice. So I hope maybe if it didn't annoy you, I hope at most I hope you enjoyed it, and at least I hope it didn't annoy you that much. So Anyway, in 2 weeks, we will be back again with another episode. This time, we will be talking to Snapshot 52. And we will be looking at basically modern Indian policy in the United States, specifically the termination era, as it is called. So hope to see you in 2 weeks. Until then, enjoy the episodes.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.